Right, well, I think I should start. On behalf of the Department of Social Work and the Social Work Alumni Association, it really is my pleasure today to welcome you here to the launch of Reflections on Social Work Careers, University of Melbourne, Social Work Alumni, 1945 to 2000. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of the Wurundjeri, on which I'm speaking to you from today, and pay my respect to their elders and families and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us.
Double the vaccination target. The state recorded 1,250.
I think there's a bit of noise coming through. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you are living, learning and working from today, as we're in an online event. Now, look, I'd like to now just provide you with a brief summary of the 80 years of social work education at University of Melbourne celebrations, of which this event is the final. We started the year with a webinar, Housing the Homeless, Prevention and Response, comprising a panel of expert discussants, some of whom were our recent alumni working in the field. This was followed by the Foundations of Social Work Education in Australia, which was led by Dr. Jane Miller AM, and a panel again of our recent MSW graduates were discussants, and it was a pretty lively event. This was followed by the Len Tierney lecture featuring Dr. Lyndall Hickey and Professor Bruce Bonahady AM, and focused on the topic of families and disabilities, which was just a fantastic event. And finally, we arrive at today's launch, which is a very exciting event for all of us who've been involved in this project. Really, all of our events have underlined both the breadth and the depth of the profession and the quality of our graduates. We've also learned that online events have really increased our audience, really beyond our wildest expectations, I'd have to say, and it's really pleasing. We'll continue with this format into the future, and of course combine it with the pleasures of face-to-face events as well. Now, I'd briefly like to outline the genesis of this project. It is absolutely true to say that without Jane Miller AM, Dr. Jane Miller AM, there would be no project. Jane has over many years assumed really the role of an informal archivist, keeping images, stories and eulogies of past social workers and their extraordinary contribution to the profession. And it really was looking at the material that Jane had that I think prompted us all in the Alumni Association and the department to really think carefully about preserving that very precious history. I'd also like to acknowledge Miriam OAM's role in really alerting us to the work of the Shoah Foundation, which led us to the search for an enduring methodology which could guide this project. And of course, that has been given flesh so expertly by Emeritus Professor Dorothy Scott, who you'll hear from later today. Professor Lou Harms has supported the project from its inception and suggested the digital library format. So we thank her greatly for that. And finally, of course, Associate Professor Ralph Hampson, Robyne Schwarz AM, Miriam OAM, and our MSW students who are here with us today for turning the adversity of the pandemic into a placement opportunity. So you'll hear all about that as we unfold the event today. As they are collected, these stories of careers in this profession, they'll comprise, as I said, a digital library that will be accessible via the Department of Social Work's website and will be available both to the general public and interested scholars. I'd also like to acknowledge at this point our limitations. We are very clear that despite our absolutely best efforts to prioritise those alumni over the age of 80, our mail-out was less than perfect, with many outside this age group receiving invitations to be interviewed. For those of you wishing to be interviewed who have missed out, I'll certainly provide contact details of Associate Professor Ralph Hampson, and please do be in touch if that's your desire. We'll get to you eventually. I'd now like to introduce Professor Louise Harms, Head of the School of Social Work, valued friend and colleague, who will address the issues of project initiation and design. Over to you, Lou.
Thank you very much, Janet. And I might just get you to move a few slides on for me there. I too want to acknowledge the Indigenous custodians of the land on which we're all living and meeting today, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and Indigenous colleagues with us today. I also want to acknowledge many of you as our alumni who've gathered, the 170 or so of you who've registered for this webinar, and to acknowledge your presence here today. And of course, all the fabulous team that Janet has mentioned have made this happen, including our student group. And just as an aside, I'm delighted to announce that one of the students presenting here today, Chloe Span, has just been recently awarded the AASW Social Work Student of the Year. So it speaks to the calibre of the students who've been involved with this project from the start. As Janet mentioned, this has been a project that's arisen in very unusual COVID times, and has been a very creative opportunity for our student learning as well as our alumni engagement. And the importance of bringing those two threads together into this social work initiative, I think, have been the most exciting elements of the project. So in the next slide, these are just some of the points that I wanted to highlight before we move into the detail of what has occurred. And the first is really to highlight that this is a continuing project of the department. It's been the inaugural year, but we really want to commit to this as a 3 to 5 year at least piece. And the excitement, therefore, of launching this with you as our alumni to engage your thinking and your networks around this, what will be a continuing project. Dorothy will speak in much greater detail about the participants, but it's really to amplify that this is about you and our history, our collective history as the staff and the students of social work at Melbourne. And so we hope that this conversation today really evokes that excitement, reflection, and critical engagement with what social work is in relation to the University of Melbourne and the long-standing history of our department and social work commitment. So the qualitative interview methodology will be unpacked. You'll get to hear about how people have come to be in this project, the ways in which our students have actively engaged in the placement side, the learning side of the critical social work skills, and also the ability to reflect on how you can access this repository that we will have, because as Janet's highlighted, one of the important pieces of this project is that it's a legacy piece for our department. And so a digital library will be there, and we hope that in the years and decades ahead that it will be an invaluable resource there for all our alumni, for researchers, you know, the pioneering work that Jane Miller has done in this space, but other social work researchers will come along and see this archive, this digital library of work as a really core base for social work thinking, past, present and future. So with that broad introduction around what the project is about, the depth now begins in this conversation. So I'm really delighted to hand over to Dorothy Scott to take us through the next steps.
Thank you, Lou. And the first part of this I'm doing on behalf of Jane Miller, who has asked me to do this. Jane is recovering from a bout of pneumonia and is with us, but not presenting today. And the first thing I think is to say that this is significant. It is significant in the history of any profession to know where it has come from, where it is now, where it may be going, and to look at the dynamic interaction between the historical context and the evolution of a profession, as well as how the profession may have an impact on that context. There is indeed a dearth of publication about Australian social work. I think we're probably focused on the doing, not looking over our shoulder at the past, but perhaps looking at the past is important as an end in itself, and also really a way perhaps of looking back to see forward. So let's add to that reservoir of knowledge in that field. Some historians have investigated periods in which social workers were active and the history of our profession. And that's a very important part of the historiography. But it's also important that we tell our own story from inside, not uncritically, to complement the work that's been done by historians. And of course, there are many histories of any one event, many perspectives, many ways of seeing it. And so the oral history can give another dimension to what can be gleaned from the primary sources of documents. The gift of hearing the voice of people long dead is a lovely phrase from Jane. And this is where we're actually able to reach back to an earlier generation which we can no longer interview through those we can interview. And Jane has captured there a few lovely little snippets from Pat Duxbury, who was interviewed, not in this project, is no longer with us, but quite some years ago. We get a glimpse of Jocelyn Hislop, her elegance, her glamour, and as Jane told me the other day, her home county's accent. So we get these little flavours that you wouldn't get from the written record. And we know, of course, from Jane's own work on Hislop, what a towering intellectual figure she was in the history of our school and way beyond. Lyra Taylor in A Canada Winter, the young Alison Player trying to live on sustenance, to understand the lived experience of the unemployed in the Depression. These are really ways we can reach back to the earlier generation, and it's delightful to do so. When my colleagues and I were writing the recent book on Lentini, a love of truth and a love of service, one of the most wonderful and heartwarming aspects of that was gathering around Jane's table and sharing our own anecdotes. And some of those anecdotes have actually been incorporated in the book. So this is really further back than just the people we interview. Oral histories round out written documents. They're not, of course, without their problem, as any historian would point out. Memory is malleable, and what we remember and what we do not remember is itself, I think, an interesting question. If we might move on to the next slide. And the other aspect is that the meaning of memory may change. So when we're interviewing someone or we are being interviewed, am I now recalling what this event meant for me back then? Or am I doing so through the filters of the time between then and now? Some very interesting questions, I think, that surround this methodology. So what did we do in this project to really try and set it on a rigorous foundation? Well, I think we've got to say right from the beginning that it was a purposive sample. We did not have the resources to interview all alumni. And of course, even if we were able to interview all alumni, there would be many who would be missing because they're not on the alumni list because they have moved or disconnected from the university over the many, many years. And of course, many alumni have died. So in no way can we assume that this is a representative sample of Melbourne University social work alumni. And then because the resources were limited, how do we select? And we thought that for obvious reasons, we should give those over 80 years priority, and we did. But that isn't all we interviewed, but we really were particularly interested in interviewing the older cohort within the alumni population. And then how do we select from that? And we wanted diversity of fields and roles as far as these were known. And so some of this was only known through our own personal knowledge, which of course is a constraint and a limiting factor. So we're not going to claim too much from our sample, and we want us to be very upfront about that. If we might move on to the next slide, please. And why in-depth interviewing, you might ask? Why not just ask people to do a survey monkey or to answer questions by writing their answers at greater length? Well, we thought that the method of in-depth interviewing really gave a much greater richness. There was an exchange between both interviewer and interviewee, where we could explore the meaning, where you could probe an answer, where you could say to the interviewee, can you tell me more about that? Or how does that fit with what you said a little earlier in the interview about such and such? So it's a much richer methodology, but of course it's a much more resource-hungry methodology. And it does include, however, people who may not, for one reason or another, wish to reply in a written questionnaire format. So that's why we were very interested in doing in-depth interviewing. And the questions, these aren't the exact questions that we asked, these are our research questions. And the specific questions we asked of interviewees were a way of operationalising these types of research questions. So we were interested in values. We're a values-based profession. We were interested in the early formative experiences that may have led to interviewees becoming social workers, wishing to study social work, and the different paths that may have been taken along that journey. We were interested in how interviewees perceived their contribution to the profession, their work. What would they highlight as the most salient aspects of their career? And again, from their perspective of now that is being asked. We were particularly interested in the historical context and how that influenced their professional experiences. And that's a very rich area for investigation. We asked about whether there were spiritual or religious influences. Was there, in a sense, a vocation at work in their choice of social work? And for some, that was very strong, and we were not quite at the point of being able to share all of the findings, but that, I think, might lend itself to also an investigation of, did that change over time? Did we find, when we're looking at later cohorts, that, for example, political issues, political times, the zeitgeist might have been more significant than in earlier cohorts, where maybe religious or spiritual influences may have been more salient. So we have questions that come out of these questions, which we will, in the fullness of time, answer when we have enough interviews done. The political beliefs, did that influence their choice of profession? Did those beliefs change? There are times of heightened social change, and what was the interface between how those times impacted on the profession and on the individual interviewee, but also how did the profession and the interviewee respond to those times? What are the major life themes of interviewees? What is seeing their profession in the broader context of their life? How did they see the future of the profession? What advice might they have to the interviewer, who was, in most instances, a current social work student? And where it was applicable, what was their experience after retirement? Do we see a continuing engagement in society that might throw light on that? And on to the next slide, please. How we might finish off with this, what we might do in the long term. Well, it lends itself to case studies of individuals, and I can think already of some that would be very rich, where you just focus on the individual and, in a sense, you tell their story through their own words, mediated through the themes and the research questions of this project. So really like mini biographies. We could also look at patterns of responses to each question. Like we could look at the different pathways coming into the profession, or at the other end, the post-retirement careers of social workers. So we could just take one of those research questions and look at the patterns, the variation and the similarities across interviewees, and particularly across age cohorts of interviewees, whether the interviewees who studied social work in the 1950s are different from those in the 60s, 70s, 80s and onwards. So we can look at this always through the lens of a cohort. We could look at patterns across questions. For example, if we were particularly interested in the religious or spiritual dimension, we might want to say, well, that may have been influential in the pathway into social work, but what about in post-retirement? Do we see any continuity, or do we see discontinuity between some of the responses across our research questions. So lots of things we could answer there. And we might zone in on a particular period. For example, the 1970s, a period of marked social change, change in social policy, change in social welfare services. And we might ask, how is Victorian social work shaped by social change? And how did social workers shape social change? And that may be quite different for those of us who were young graduates in the 1970s and stirring things up, and those who were in much more senior roles. So again, you can think of some of the richness and complexity of zeroing in on a particular decade. So there's a lot to be done in analysing the data, but of course we still have a lot more data to collect. And I'd now like to pass on, hoping that I'm passing on to Miriam to take us through the next slide.
Thank you, Dorothy. Good morning, and what a pleasure it is to share some information about our participation in this most fulfilling project. We began by thinking about how best we might engage with our students, and Robyne, Schwarz and I had the pleasure of being asked to both provide some kind of supervision and monitoring together with Ralph Hampson in an ongoing way during the placement experience of our students. We held 8 sessions with them, 7 of them held virtually, and one precious session was actually held face-to-face in the university because we were very much influenced and affected by COVID lockdowns. We began by interviewing students individually in mid-May, settling on 10 participants, and then holding our first student group session on the 24th of May. We've since added one later student who was able to benefit from mentoring from one of her more experienced classmates and some written briefing documents which have been prepared after our first series, and these are going to be helpful, hopefully, for our later cohorts. We spent a fair amount of time engaging with the students, getting to know them and them us, and learning about their experience in interviewing, volunteering, and friendly visiting, which might help in their experience. And to ensure that this project provided a worthwhile, relevant, and constructive, and partly theoretical learning experience, we built on Dorothy and Jane's 2 sessions on qualitative and historical research by discussing the following issues, which all would likely come into play during their interviews. So we covered relationship building, interviewing skills, self-awareness, cultural differences, age-related issues in conducting interviews, recording skills, both technological and in writing, and as mentioned by Dorothy just now, the socio-economic and historical context in which our subjects undertook their social work careers. We spent some time on the questions that Dorothy has outlined just now, and we also worked on probes because obviously sometimes interviewees need some extra help in giving answers, only in terms of giving open-ended probes for them. We also conducted several role-play interviews, offering ourselves as subjects and then reflecting on feedback and impressions with the group. This gave us the opportunity to cover barriers to effective communication and to foreshadow issues the students might encounter during their actual interviews, especially as our subjects are seniors. Occasionally feigning deafness and vision impairment, we endeavoured to predict some of the possible stumbling blocks. And then we sent them out. And the students made their own arrangements to make the interviews, and some of them met in person and some through Zoom. COVID lockdown certainly threw curveballs at us, as we had hoped the students would generally make home visits and interview their subjects face-to-face. In many cases, this proved impossible, and many of the eventual meetings were held via Zoom. The chance to offer virtual interviews did, however, provide some worthwhile opportunities, as several of our subjects reside in regional areas or overseas, and they were able to be included, whereas that might not have been possible if we were doing all this face-to-face. Some of the challenges involved included the vagaries of recording devices, the sending and receiving back of interview transcripts, their editing and provision back to the subjects for checking and approval. Inevitably, delays did happen, but the process was in fact surprisingly timely in completion, and we're grateful to Ralph Hampson, who arranged the provision of iPads for recording and facilitated the transcription process. Having completed the preparatory phase, we then convened to debrief and gather learnings and takeaways. We were able to assist the students to reflect on their interviews and the issues they encountered. We're pleased that 20 interviews could be completed and that student feedback indicated that this was a successful, if unusual, placement experience for them. Now, my dry and factual account of this process totally fails to describe the richness of the experience that Robyne and I encountered in working on this project. So I'll now hand over to Robyne to share some of our perceptions and responses. Thank you.
Can you, I'm not sure you can see me. Okay. Thank you, Miriam. I want to share very briefly some of my impressions and perceptions of the placement. As Miriam said, it really was a COVID placement. We conducted it almost entirely in lockdown. And whilst I need to say it's very convenient to have it on Zoom, and there would be the students, the 10 of them, and Ralph and Miriam and myself, and we would all be in little boxes, and that was great. But as social workers, I think our core business is actually people and interacting with them in the most beneficial way. And I'm not sure doing it online is as good as doing it in real time, but it was practical and we did it. As Miriam said, we had one session at the university. It was really exciting for Miriam and I to go there and see those little faces in boxes as real people. And that was really good. But what really I was struck by, that I understood at that time when we met with the students, none of them had ever been on campus, had ever been to the university, and none of them, no, that's not true. I think Chloe had, she was a second year, but they hadn't met each other. So that really shows you how COVID and the pandemic has impacted in so many different ways. The next thing I want to, or the issue or the perception, was about the students. I think I can speak for Miriam and I. We were very impressed with them as a group, the way they operated as a group. They were very respectful of each other and highly supportive of each other, and that manifested in the way they managed the tasks that were set for them. They did wonderful literature reviews on certain aspects that Miriam has highlighted. They analysed past interviews. They started to develop a framework, a beginning way of analysing the interviews. So whatever they did came to us in a seamless way. We don't know how they went about it, but they did it really well, and that was very impressive. The next impression was really the placement, in a way, was an interaction between the new and the old, and I say old in the most positive way. The students, the emerging social workers, the students interacting in a very, you know, these were 3-hour sessions that, as Miriam said, went on for 8 weeks with Ralph or Miriam and myself, and I'll have to speak for Ralph too, whether that's okay. Miriam and my careers have finished. Ralph's has taken another path, but we have completed our careers, and we were able to reflect with them in those practice interviews about our careers. And I don't think they were doing it just because they had to, or they weren't being truthful, but my impression was that they really appreciated having firsthand knowledge and information about our careers, our challenges, our successes, the impact emotionally on us, our values, the context in which we practiced. And they really appreciated that. But for me, and I think I can speak for Miriam, it benefited us in a way that I didn't expect it. It was the first time I'd really been able to reflect on my career as a whole, rather than little snippets of it over time. And I found that very helpful to put some sort of closure and some sort of, something positive about being able to do that. And that leads me to the last point. I think the placement very much mirrored the project and the goals of the project. Firstly, the knowledge or the thirst for knowledge and understanding, as Dorothy's pointed out, what you get out of doing something about this, about the people that have gone before you, your history for newer social workers, current social workers, people who aren't social workers, but also the positive effect on those who were interviewed, as Miriam and I were in the placement. I found that incredibly positive. And I'm sure if I asked many of you who have been or are going to be interviewed, you'd say the same thing. So it really underscored the importance of the project for me. So now I would like to pass on to Chloe Spann and Associate Professor Fiona McDermott and for their presentation.
Thanks, Robyne and Miriam. Just to start with, would like to say that both of you and Ralph did create a really safe environment for us as students, and that mattered. Okay, and I know that we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the section after us with Ralph as project manager and students Ella, Lizzie, Iris and I, just to reflect more on the placement experience, but did want to acknowledge that. So thank you. I think for this section, Fiona and I had a conversation about how we'd like to do this. And we thought that we'd start off by talking more generally about the interview experience as an introduction, and then pull out a couple of key highlights that we came up with sort of separate from the interview process at a later date. So I'll just check in with Fiona now and see how she's going there. Would you like to go first there, Fiona?
Look, thanks, Chloe, and thank you for the opportunity to have been part of the project. I have to say, I was a little doubtful at first. I thought, not sure about this. But Chloe has been such a fabulous interviewer and listener and drawer out of things that I hadn't kind of expected to be talking about, that it's turned into a very thought-provoking and enjoyable process. And a bit like Robyne was saying, I'm used to reflecting on, ideas and theories and practices and the way of the world, but I'm not particularly experienced, I shouldn't say experienced. I haven't really reflected on my career as such. So that was really a great thing to do. And what really struck me, one of the things that really struck me, was how a so-called career is such a collective activity. It sounds like something an individual does, but when you reflect on it, it's really something woven out of a web of other people, of opportunities, of challenges and criticisms and support and guidance and so on. And you arrive at a point where that is formed itself into what we might call a career. And I think that was really a very, very kind of obvious to me as I worked with the questions that Chloe asked and the ones she kind of drew out as we went along. So I have to say it was a terrific experience, and I'd like to thank her for her. I'm not surprised she's ASW student excellent for this year. She was fabulous to work with. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. And I must say that working with Fiona and a number of the other interviewees was a privileged experience. And I think in terms of the research placement in itself, was always pretty curious about what goes on behind the scenes of the university, what's happening in the social work research department, separate from the coursework type thing. However, similar to what you were saying just then, Fiona, wasn't necessarily prepared at the beginning of the placement for a lot of the thoughtfulness of the conversations. And the reality of the situation for many of us as students was that we were meeting people who would otherwise probably remain, a name or a citation in a book. And yet in adopting the role of researcher, we got to see the whole person. And I just can't imagine any other situation of having that benefit of a focused conversation where we can exercise our curiosity. We could ask explorative questions and, try and understand what was lying underneath some of the motivations and decisions from the people that we were interviewing, and that was, a real gift. So I'm grateful for that. If anything, from that, what it kind of gave me just personally a little bit of a sense of more to what I think Robyne was talking about before as well, and Dorothy, is that we're actually as students connected to something bigger than ourselves. So, there are people who have come before us, and there were people, there's social workers that will come after us, and we're actually connected to a wider network. And that was really comforting as a takeaway from the placement, and also just to understand that, we're actually not alone in this. Other people have, dealt with similar struggles and successes, and they will continue to do so. So I think that probably takes us on to our second point quite well, which is about how the interviews in themselves were sort of talking about the past in many ways, but at the same time shaping the future. And there was a couple of mentions in the interview that Fiona was talking about when she was a student and sort of like an early career social worker, and she said that some of the main pressing issues at the time were things like women's rights, fighting for an equal distribution of wealth, and upholding the value of human rights, amongst a number. However, for me, and perhaps for other students as well, the thing that sort of struck me most was that, these are still valid and important issues today. And it was just in general really affirming to hear from someone who was very kind and generous throughout the whole interview process, to say that these are still, these are causes worthy of support, and they really need future generations to carry them forward. So look, I'm just going to quickly read a couple of takeaways that we thought Fiona mentioned were possible progressions for social work, where we're in a good position as social workers to take these issues forward. And they were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander reconciliation, the lack of rights ascribed to asylum seekers, particularly in Australia, and the consumer movement. So elevating the voices of people whose experiences can help shape programs designed for them. I just really needed to read that out. So thank you. Would you like to lead on to the next point, Fiona?
Yes, certainly. It was one of the things that came out of Chloe and Mai's kind of chewing the fat after the we're reading the transcripts and the interviews, was that, you know, you tend to, when you look back, you tend to highlight things that went well, achievements and so on. But I think there's not a person in the world who hasn't had setbacks, disappointments, articles not accepted by journals, grants not got, jobs not got, and so on. You know, we perhaps tend to gloss over those a little bit, but really they're very important part of where we kind of get to. And I suppose, you know, as perhaps social workers starting out, I guess there's a message there about you know, disappointments for sure, but don't let them set you back, because you know, it's a bit of a truism to say that they might open up other opportunities. I certainly found that. I found myself in places I hadn't expected to be, and one course of action may no longer become possible, but another one kind of opens up. So when you look back, you can get quite a sense of that, you know, the angst and the disappointment passes. Other things happen. The world opens up in a different way, and I mean, it's great to celebrate and enjoy the reminiscence of the highlights and the successes, but they're kind of within a context of things that don't always go to plan. And I guess, you know, sensitivity to that is, you know, when you think about where social workers work and with whom they work, it's often people who are dealing with precisely those disappointments and setbacks. So there's kind of a mutual reward in understanding the impact of those, but I guess being confident or optimistic that they can also be chances to move somewhere where you hadn't anticipated finding yourself next time.
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything to that, Chloe, or should we move on to our third point?
Look, I think, yes, well, it probably leads quite well into the third point in many ways, which is sort of about how, I suppose for myself, listening to Fiona reflecting on her career and talking about things like, you know, in her 30s when she decided to go back to do a master's and to do some academic study, that was when, you know, she really kind of leaned in to academia and really took it on and started really enjoying it. And I think for that was, you know, it was an insight, and it also sort of normalized the career journey in a lot of ways, and made you realize that as much as it might be a case of setting out to reach a certain goal, it's very much a combination of how you choose to carry yourself, and the way you interact with people, engage with superiors and other work colleagues, that leads to different opportunities. So I think one thing I took away from what Fiona was saying is that, you know, there's an element of, you know, keep being present in your environment, but also creating your own luck. And sometimes that means needing to be assertive, needing to be bold, taking steps into the unknown, while also just having a good sense of self, understanding where your boundaries are, knowing where you might end, and holding on to things that keep you sort of grounded, like that critical thinking, and taking your time if you need to. So I think that pretty much sums up the last point for me there. Fiona, have you got any other final words there?
Oh, yes, just one. I sort of thought, you know, if I was looking back at my earlier self setting out, I would really say that it's great to go in directions you haven't anticipated, opportunities that you might just not know what's around the corner, I guess. And there's, while it's quite anxiety provoking to go somewhere where you haven't been before, I reckon it's more important to be have a bit of anxiety that you are going to be part of something that's going to unfold later. So I guess as if I was talking back to myself at 30, I'd say, you know, fear not, don't be anxious, other than to see the opportunities here. And that social work is such a rich profession with so many threads and opportunities. I discovered that while that is true, I've also had, you know, preoccupations, and in my 30s, I think my master's thesis was on social work as a complex field, something like that. And I interviewed a whole lot of social planners to learn about the complexity of their work. And here I am 40 years later, I'm just about to start work on a book on complexity and social work practice. So I think it's kind of interesting that these preoccupations stay with you, and despite all the movings in and out along the way. So yes, note to younger self, be bold, step into the unknown, you know, it's things will work out. That's probably all I would add to that.
Okay. Thank you.
So Chloe and I have had a really good time. We've learnt a lot, but now I think, should we hand over to Ralph?
Yes, that's a good idea. I think that there is Ralph and Ella and Lizzie and Iris talking about the placement experience next.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Fiona. I think one of the things I've been reflecting, listening, is as the kind of project manager person, what we taught our students was that social workers are context experts. And what I see here on the screen is the people who made this possible. This has been a team effort. It hasn't been any one individual. And you can see we've all played different parts. And as the project manager, I just want to thank everyone for the respectful way we've all worked together to come to this point. The other thing I'd say is the gift to me is I'm not an alumni of Melbourne University, I'm an alumni of Sydney University. So I got to learn about social work in Melbourne through this process and its history, which was fascinating because we were the only school of social work in Victoria for quite a long period of time. So when the students reflected to Miriam and I, they often talked about, well, why wouldn't we interview people from other universities? Well, suddenly they learned there was only one university at that particular time. Why aren't there any Indigenous social workers being interviewed? Because there weren't any Indigenous social workers in that early time of social work. So really that conversation with the students and Miriam and I helped to do that. And one of the things I need to do is to also thank the two people, Oya Adern and Michelle Ball, who provided the supervision and the liaison visits for the students who are on placement with us. So they were another pair, probably more invisible behind the scenes, but I know Michelle is with us today, and they were the people who helped the students bring together all of this learning. And what I think for many of the students was quite overwhelming at the beginning, that suddenly you're dealing with all of these, what we then at the moment then called pioneers. So it was a big learning experience. But what I'm going to do is ask our students to reflect, and they've been doing some work on this, so thank you. And they've given me an order they'd like me to ask them to reflect, so I will do that. But the first thing is we wanted students to reflect for you, what were the project highlights? So I'm going to ask Lizzie to start with that.
First of all, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here today. Thank you to Ralph and the rest of the project leadership team for inviting us to participate in this event. One of the many highlights of this placement for me was the opportunity to learn about the amazing experiences of the social work alumni, the immense career possibilities and diversity of a social work career. it excited me to see that a social work career is not restrictive, that there are many different paths. It doesn't have to be linear, and we can and should move around to both broaden and deepen our experience and knowledge in the early stages of our careers. Yeah, and I suppose, Ralph, you want me to pass it on to the next student?
That'd be great. So Lizzie, now Ella.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ralph, and thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be part of this project and to be here. So my project highlight was around the history of social work and really gaining a sense of the Australian history and the local history through the stories of alumni, which was just such an indispensable sort of unwritten history, which isn't really a part of our curriculum per se, but which to me has really oriented me to the place and to the profession. So during the placement, this is my first placement and my first year of the degree. There's a real emphasis, I think, on developing your professional identity. And I think, how can you do that without having some understanding of your forebears and the people who've paved the way and really made the profession what it is? So to me, that's absolutely essential and a real highlight for me.
Thank you, Ella. Chloe.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I must say that one of the other things that came up for me, which actually isn't on the slide, is that working with the students as a peer group was an absolute highlight for me personally, and really enjoyed being able to get to know a lot of the other students on the placement. I learned a lot from them, and that in itself was valuable as a takeaway. In terms of what's here, I think it's talking about the Whitlam years, and one of the sort of reoccurring themes that we spoke about and reflected on as a peer group was how many pioneers talked about that time as a real motivator, as something that they drew a lot of hope and inspiration from. And again, similar to what we were talking about just before with Fiona, for myself, that was sort of a real, grounding in what it is that we want to do here. What is the purpose of us joining the social work profession, and perhaps carrying forward some of the ideas of that time, and the vision of Whitlam is not lost. It's still very relevant, and that was really came clear to me throughout the project. Yeah, thanks, Ralph.
Thanks, Chloe. And just to add, 9 of the students that did the first placement were on their first placement, and Chloe was a second-year student on the placement, just to give a bit of context. And now I'm going to ask Iris to speak. Iris is currently on placement with us, actually living the project. And because COVID has lessened, Iris has been able to interview the most pioneers so far. So she's interviewed 5 people. So Iris, your reflections? And she benefited, as Robyne and Miriam said, from all of the work the first group of students did.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say there has been so many highlights, because working with people, they have been so engaged, very collaborative, and very supportive. But it was very interesting to reflect on how social workers navigate a world which isn't black and white, nor are the solutions that many social workers come up with black and white. Often, they have to be very creative and use a healthy amount of intuition. But also it takes a lot of humility in social work to reflect on mistakes or areas on which someone can improve on. And so there's always this thirst to learn, to grow, and to evolve. Thank you.
Thanks, Iris. So the next thing we wanted the students to do for you was reflect on, well, we had many people who said things to us like, how could this be a placement? what could students learn, what were they learning about social work, and I hope the students have given you some idea that they learnt an awful lot. The other, as an interlude, is Miriam, Robyne and I pretended to be the interviewees, as Miriam said. And what was fascinating to us in that process was they interviewed us, several times, as we told a different story every time we were interviewed. And whatever day it was, we reflected on something different one week than we did the previous week. So that's one of the interesting things, is interviews are capturing a person in a moment in time. So that was great fun. And I did want to emphasize that there was a lot of fun, there was a lot of camaraderie in this project, and there still is. And the students also, as a group, worked so hard behind the scenes. They actually met together, did all sorts of things, as Robyne mentioned, that we didn't know about, but they worked terrifically as a small group together and learnt a lot from the peer experience. So that's why we're hoping next year we'll have another similar group of students to do that. So in the placement learnings, Chloe, you're up first. What did you learn about being on placement?
Sure, thank you. Well, I think just in general, coming to that point about, taking away important values from social work and the principles that underpin social work was just really it just became a lot clearer from being involved in the placement. And I really do hope that the university continues to offer students the chance to have that, that opportunity to put their researcher hat on and do some interviews with alumni, because that was a really important part of the placement. It was very meaningful. And I think that was probably, one of the loveliest parts of it. Thanks.
Lizzie, over to you.
Thank you. I learned the importance of interviewing with purpose and with discipline, putting aside your personal curiosity, I suppose, and always keeping the aim of your interaction in mind, especially in a project like this, where one of the key objectives, I suppose, was to be rigorous in a way we collect information. And I think this is a transferable skill for future practice. We will always need to maintain a balance, I guess, between theoretical perspectives and our personal values and beliefs when working with clients. So yeah, that's one of my main learnings, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Lizzie. Ella?
Hello. I learned so much from the project team and so much from the brilliant people who I interviewed as well. A really pertinent theme, I think, that emerged for me across the interviews that I did was, I think, a sense of the transferability of social work skills, and also this idea of your core self that you carry across you, no matter what field of practice you're in or what stage of your career you're in, and that you are sort of the sum of your experiences, your personal and professional experiences, and your values, like your sense of inquiry, your commitment to social justice. I think those transcend fields of experience, and it is akin to something of a calling or a vocation. That was a really beautiful lesson to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Ella. Iris.
Thank you, Ralph. Well, behind the scenes, what really goes on in the project is data collection. And so there's a real focus on data integrity. Because all the hard work of everyone in the project, that's the evidence. The data is the evidence. It's a historical archive of its kind. And when people do get to look at the historical archive that we've developed, they will find all the stories of the participants in there, which reflect the history of social work, which reflect this dynamic and evolving field. And also you'll find what really is at the heart of social work, the importance of human connection and a desire for a world which is more just, where individuals, families, and communities are more fulfilled. And that was the aim of many social workers who we interviewed. They have a very strong value base.
Thank you, Iris. So I'd like to thank our students before I wrap up this little section. For me, is these students have remained as volunteers with us on the project, and I want to thank them for that. So they're not on placement anymore. They're here today in their own capacity as students of our degree who want to contribute to the profession. So here are our hopefully future pioneers sitting with us today. I'd also like to thank all the people the students interviewed. I got no negative feedback as the project manager from anybody about the actual process of being interviewed. And I know Lou has put in the chat function that you can register with the alumni. And if you are interested in becoming an interviewee, you can contact me, and Janet will let you know that later. And just for me, it was really interesting how the 1970s, when I was at university in the 70s and early 80s, how much that came through in all of the interviews was the importance of the Whitlam years. And also, as we've reflected as the project control group, that was also a period when social work expanded dramatically in Australia too. Melbourne was no longer the only school of social work in Victoria. And social work, I think there are now 34 schools of social work in Australia. So thank you to the students. I really appreciate all the hard work you've done. And Janet, I'm going to hand back to you because I'm not sure who I was supposed to hand over to.
Well, it's Lou Harms that we're handing over to. Lou, you can do some
Thanks. Thanks, Janet. Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, everyone, for just such superb presentations. And we'll come to some more thank yous in a moment. This is an opportunity now for us to open it up for questions and answers or conversation from the audience. And it's terrific to see there's already one question in there for the panel. So I think we could come to a gallery view. Mel, if we can switch over to that potentially so that everyone's ready to answer a question. And Janet, that might just be coming off share screen. Lovely. So we've got a question here from Michelle Arnell, who's unfortunately had to leave us, but she'll listen to the recording. And she reflects there on how lovely it is to connect with colleagues in this way and have this intergenerational dialogue. Her question to you all is, and us all, is how does our history prepare us for this future that we're facing? So it's a big question there, and perhaps we want to just pick it up in the context of a post-COVID world even. But how, in reflecting on the discussion today, does someone want to open that up? But how does hearing our history prepare us for the future?
Lou, if I can just step in, because I think some of what our students just covered exactly addressed that. They spoke about values, they spoke about connections with people, and I really think they're our best tools, our social work values, our ability to connect, and also they spoke about wanting to improve people's situation. And I guess these are themes that will always run through the work of social workers. And one must assume, and we do assume this in teaching our future generations, that this is what will strengthen them and give them abilities to face that future, whatever it might bring.
Thanks, Miriam. Dorothy? And I'll just note, this is actually a question from Mark Silver. He's clarified under the pseudonym of Michelle Arnell.
Yes, I would say that while the project, of course, gets down to the micro and very individual level, it's through the microcosm of the individual interviewee that you start to see the big background, the big picture. So I think going beyond this project and understanding further into the past, so going back, say, to the late 19th century, then it gives a broad framework of understanding civil society, the state, and the market. And that social work came out of civil society. It came out of community service organisations, some faith-based, some not, responding to the challenges of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And then there were events like the polio epidemic, which came through, and if you want to look at, say, social work in the Children's Hospital, you start to see, and the disability sector, you see an epidemic, a pandemic having an impact. But I'm thinking more about the broad dynamic relationship between state, market and civil society, and particularly today when we see employment services that were once of the state contracted out to the market. We see services that were once of civil society contracted to the market. We see the challenge in community service organisations in the contract state having to resist the temptation to become bureaucratic. So I think that there's a very big picture lens which looking back gives us in looking forward.
Because they're extraordinary. I mean, if we're just looking at that span of history, it's an extraordinary refocusing of our practice context, whatever that is. If you look at this post-COVID space, even our ability to connect in this space privatises and individualises the space in ways that you're speaking were so different in that civil society conversation. And if we look at the NDIS and what's happening in that space, there's individualisation, privatisation going on in so many ways that presents an enormous challenge to the infiltration of social work, service delivery, program delivery, policy influence. So Ralph, would be interested to hear your thoughts.
It just made me reflect that we also have international students who, of course, have not been here because of COVID, many of them, but we're now all hopeful that the world will open up and universities will be able to survive but we have normally had about 25% of international students. And I think this project offers them a history because often our international students think Australia has always been liberal-minded, has always had rights. And what this project does is also tell us the story of change. As social change happened, social workers were often boundary riders in those periods. They were the kind of doing the practice, but challenging the practice at the same time. So I think there's some richness there, Lou, for a growing number of international students who would like our alumni to know that we have fabulous international students, some of whom top our courses some year. So we're looking forward to them coming back.
Terrific. Thanks, Ralph. I'll encourage our audience to add any questions into the mix, but to pick up with you, Iris.
Thank you so much. I think that history is very cyclical, and many social issues, we see them reoccur. And it's just so wonderful to be able to build on the skills and knowledge of others that come before you. But also looking at history does give you a deeper understanding of poverty, of trauma, of issues that we continue to see. And it's also important to know the role that social work has had in the past, how it's been changing to meet the demands, how research has grown, how have schools changed. You know, a lot of social workers that I've interviewed have seen the knowledge and the research base which has grown, which has also shifted the way they see their own practice. So
It's such an important consciousness raising, isn't it, that history showing us what we can be not aware of as well as much as aware of, and that context can change that lens so profoundly. Thanks, Iris. We've got a question here from Irene Rensenbrink. Hello, Irene, who's wondering about the differences the interviewers might find between social workers who began their studies as mature adults and much younger students. Irene applied for the Dipsoc Studs course at Melbourne Uni in 1967 at the age of 18. And remember Len Tierney suggesting a year of working at Myer might be a good idea. I, of course, felt I was ready to change the world. Open that question up to the panel.
I'm wondering if Robyne Schwarz might not reflect on that question, given that she was a mature age student, unlike many of us.
Thanks, Robyne. You're just on mute at the moment.
Here I am. I'm here again.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was a very mature student. Obviously, it was hugely advantageous, but I wouldn't say that just about social work. I would say that about medicine, law, whatever. And without giving, I suppose I can give, you know, advertising to the University of Melbourne. I think the Melbourne model is the way to go. Not to have any student go from, I mean, there are economic and, you know, social disadvantage issues, but for any student to go to even decide they're going to do medicine or social work or law or whatever they're going to do at 17 or 18 is ludicrous. So a liberal, you know, a more mature student through a liberal arts precursor to a vocational course, to me, is far more, you know, is the way we all should be going. So for me in social work, I don't want to go on, but it was like all that life experience, all that, it was just, you know, it was a huge advantage to me.
Janet.
Well, I started life in psychiatric nursing, and I did a number of years of both acute and psychogeriatric nursing, and, you know, came into social work later in life. And I always felt that background equipped me incredibly well and made me a very pragmatic social worker. So I thought it was a real plus. And I noticed from, you know, my teaching activities and the understanding that we have the profile of students in the course. I mean, our average age is 28 in this course. We attract a group of students who come into it with a history, and you know, they're a pleasure to teach.
And I'd also say for the third or so that come through the direct pathway after a 3-year, typically liberal arts education, thrive in the course equally. So I think it really does demonstrate that it's bringing together, I think, what you're highlighting, Irene, that motivation to change the world, to address inequality is there, and the course promotes that development and engagement in the profession and in different ways and at different stages so beautifully. So do we have another, Ralph?
I just wanted to add to that one of the things the students didn't tell us about is how, by doing the interviews, they learnt about social work being such a broad church, that there are many opportunities for them, that there are so many possibilities. And I think, as Chloe and Fiona reflected on, being bold about your careers, being brave, and I know that's something we teach in our degree, is to say to our students, you know, go out there, have a go. Janet, you know, says take a locum to begin your career. That this is it's exploratory, and I think that was really what came through to me as I spoke to all the students, was they had never before understood the breadth and the possibilities, which was pretty exciting for them, I think.
Thank you, Ralph. Janet, I'm not sure if your hand's still up to respond in that. Otherwise, I would move on to another question.
I don't know why it's still up. It seems to be permanently up, which is...
You have to click on it.
But I did notice that Mark Silver has said this lovely comment: the project has made so clear that the future of social work is in such great hands. And the transfer of value says something about the tradition. Isn't that wonderful? And then Tiffany's raised, you know, the largest question one might possibly raise about the tension between the systems we work in and the ethics and values of our profession.
And so would someone like to pick up that conversation piece of that tension?
Can I perhaps just say that always problems, but we spoke a lot in our preparation sessions about supervision and the opportunity to reflect and debrief, and we're inevitably in a social work career going to confront some of these situations, and we need support. We need colleagues, we need supervisors, we need mentors. And I think as social workers, if we can keep that in mind, in not only needing them, but being them at the right times, I think that can be very helpful. So that would be my answer to that question.
Can I invite anyone else to respond to that question?
I'm happy to. I mean, I think it's a central problem for all professions. We are all caught up in systems that we work with that have many other incentives other than the values and ethics that inform your own profession. And it's part of the real politic, I think, of being a professional is how you navigate that. And I think my own sense is that you have to have a very attuned capacity to deal with high levels of ambiguity and to really manage those. And it's not easy. There are plenty of times when you're drawn into real, genuine, deep dilemmas, and sometimes you need to make a stand on those. You also need to pick your, your fights. Some fights are really worth having, others are just not. And it's the judgment about knowing what are the fights you need to have and what are the ones you really need to, sidestep. So I think this is just a central problem for any, and, look, organisations today don't often appreciate professionals because they come with an independence, a different perspective, a different set of loyalties. So, these are just omnipresent pressures, I think, for most professional groups. What we have, of course, is some of the skills to analyse some of those tensions, which a lot of professionals don't. They're very ill prepared.
Thanks, Janet. Fiona.
Yes, there's the skills to analyse is the point I was going to come in on, Janet, because I think, social work has a very strong understanding of, person in psychosocial contexts, micro, macro, meso as a kind of one of the frames for looking at the world. And it seems to me that we need to spend more time at the meso level. Micro is really important, but to hop into the meso and try and see the ways in which the micro and the macro influence where you can go, how you can go on, how you can work, I guess. And it's perhaps a slightly neglected part of the frame, but I think we need to be stronger as meso players who are informed by micro and macro, and I think that perhaps allows us some sort of objectivity, some kind of position to stand and look and think before we act.
And this project is such a brilliant opportunity, Fiona, isn't it, to garner those reflections historically, and then as we get to more recent alumnus, the ways in which that piece of work is so critical, and maybe it's even a question to really make sure is part of the conversation there, because it is just that critical interface. Now, I think we have another question here, a couple more coming through. So again from Tiffany, thanking for the responses there. And this question was actually raised in a conversation between me and a student with a current practitioner, and this is exactly what she has experienced in the past few months. So the lived experience, this is what I want to seek out more of your lived experience, picking up on Tiffany's earlier question about that confrontation between the systems and the self, I guess, in the social work role. So does anyone want to share an experience of that meso piece, that navigating the tension, Janet, that you spoke of organisationally?
What I'm trying to dig deep into, into the many conflicts and issues that you confront. And look, I can't actually think of anything off the top of my head. I think it's a pretty profound area of inquiry, and it would, take some dedication on my part to really reflect on that. But I know I've confronted it, and I noticed Dorothy's got her hand up, and so has Ralph. So I'll hand over to one of them. Excellent.
Ralph, Dorothy?
Well, I think Janet's being too modest, because I remember her as a relatively young graduate, mature age student graduate, standing up with extraordinary courage in relation to an Aboriginal prisoner who was in solitary confinement, becoming repeatedly psychotic because of his cruel isolation. And as it went up and up and up the hierarchy in the Department of Corrections, there was one person standing, and that was Janet Farrow. So I think, Janet, you are an exemplar of doing this, and that it does take a personal cost to do that and to take it as far as you did. I think that one of the things we might do with this project is to scan the data for looking for exemplars of this very thing. This is the sort of sub-theme that could come out and be given high salience. And we could look at situations where we fail. One of the original questions we had, which sort of got watered down a little bit, was what lessons did you learn the hard way? And that requires some pretty harsh self-reflection, but also lessons that we sometimes don't succeed when we go in as advocate for a client. But sometimes there are possibilities if we take that wonderful North American adage, going from case to cause, which has both beautiful meanings, going from the individual case to a social cause, but also going from an individual case in terms of its causation or its etiology. I think that there are times in our lives when we can go from case to cause, usually with others rather than on our own, and we should seek those. And perhaps that's where the professional body, ASW, comes into it, but it may also be that there are other coalitions that we can forge where we can go from case to cause. But the pain of not being able to do so in every case is, I think, a major burden for social workers and for some other professions. And there are times when one has to leave a place of work where the moral burden becomes too great, as does the emotional burden.
Thank you, Dorothy. Ralph?
It was really to say that this tension came up in this placement with Robyne, Miriam and I, when our students had to listen to interviews of people who had worked with Indigenous people and some of the practices that were reported in the interviews, that our students asked us questions about, well, you know, why didn't social work address that? Because as Dorothy said, we gave the students a background of the historical periods and why certain things were important at certain times because of the political landscape. So I think they did come up throughout the project for us in kind of that, what can happen, that tension of everything in social work was bad and old-fashioned versus, you know, it's all new and exciting now. So I think this project really does speak to that complexity. And I think I'm certainly working with Janet very closely. It's that idea that this tension is real, but it's also, it's not something you can just fix. You actually have to lean into it. And I think our students learnt about that the interviewees were actually leaning into very difficult social issues and grappling with them at their time of their careers in their lives. But I think it's well and truly alive, but I think it's having the courage we wanted our students to do was to talk about it and not say that, not fall into what Iris called the black and white. So, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. There are some other questions here. So let me just scroll those. I think, Vernon, we've got your question there that Dorothy's reminded us all of the rich community-based traditions and history of our profession. And so how do we ensure that the current community agencies don't all end up looking and acting like government departments? So along some of those threads that we've been discussing, wondering if someone would like to comment.
I'm happy to give some comment about it. I think it is a real risk for non-government organisations, the funded sector, so dependent on government funding that you can become, you know, merely an agent. In my experience, you have to really gather your advocacy material. After all, you become the experts in how government policy is implemented, actually. And you need to really gather that material and, again, pick your fights. Pick the things that are really worth going into bat about, and there are plenty of those issues about, but it is a major tension, an issue.
So we'll go Miriam and then Chloe.
If I can just say, it's a tension that I've experienced throughout my career. I was often in a very lucky situation in that I worked in settings where fundraising was possible and where some of the funds that funded our programs were independently sourced and not government provided, which meant there was some kind of independence and ability to set some objectives and directions that weren't necessarily controlled by the requirements of government funding. I realise that's not always possible, but I think it is important to remember the philanthropic sector.
Thanks, Miriam. And Chloe?
Yes, thank you. And it's funny that Miriam said that, because I think the philanthropic sector is a really, important thing to bring up here, similar to the point that Dorothy was raising earlier about civil society, and how in the interviews we heard a lot about alumni that chose to do social work that wasn't necessarily a paid position. And that was something that had carried through with them, into, retirement, even though people were still choosing to take up a lot of different voluntary roles or different sorts of honorary positions. And I just wonder about how, with the, we've got our ethics, our code of ethics, and these sorts of things, and social work is really taking on a huge challenge in dealing with a lot of the nuance of people's situations and the contexts in which they're in. So, I just wonder if, really, social justice and those ideas mean that it's a way of life after a while. It's not just a job, and that's significant. Yeah.
I think that's incredibly significant, Chloe, and I think perhaps a note to end on in that sense from this excellent discussion, noting that there are comments and questions there, but I think it highlights the deep commitment that people have personally and professionally to the work that we do as social workers. So I'm just going to make a 60-second or so comment as we wrap up today's session, and then hand to Janet for the very important thank yous of today's discussion. I hope you, like me, are feeling as charged up around the issues that this project is highlighting for our alumni, for our profession, and for our student learning, and to see all that come together in this discussion, and to know that it's coming together in the project is just superb. I think for me today, I take away very much the questions and challenges of the methodology, Dorothy, that you raised so importantly for us. So what we do in our research, the risks, benefits and opportunities of all of that space have played out in this project learning, and will continue to do that very deeply. I think the student learnings just sit with us and resonate with us. I think, Chloe, the line around being connected to something bigger than us, I think is just something so important that this project highlights, and how sustaining that is for us individually and collectively as a profession, when we've got those touchstones of history and present and future, and the ways in which we, I think it was Fiona, your reflection on this idea of a collective career. I think that strength that gives the discipline is just such an important way for us all to be thinking about we're part of a collective career here, and I think we've celebrated that here in many ways today. So I think in this 80th year of social work education at Melbourne, this final event of celebrating the achievements, the learnings, the regrets of the profession over the 80 years, it's extraordinary to feel that there is such continuity and change in the profession, and the continuity and change of people's lives, people who are dealing with the inequities and the challenges and the adversity, and particularly as we move into this post-COVID era where so many of those pre-existing vulnerabilities have cracked wide open in our community. How in the social work values, the skills, the principles and the collective, there's such a commitment to making that change happen. And so I hope in that sense this project plays a small part, if not a very significant part, in narrating that cause and inspiring all of us to continue in that cause by having something so clearly articulated for us all to reflect on. So I personally thank the team enormously, Ralph and all of you who've been working so fearlessly and tirelessly over this very difficult year. And I hope this project continues to thrive in the years ahead. But I would now hand to Janet to do the very important thank yous as we wind up today.
Thank you, Lou. I'll just go back to this screen, although it's a bit messy, I must say. There we go. Look, I would just like to thank all of our speakers and contributors today, Lou, Dorothy, Miriam, Robyne, Chloe, Fiona, Ralph, Ella, Lizzie and Iris, but I'd also like to put in a very big thank you to Mel Schmidt, who has worked behind the scenes to make it all happen. And of course, to all of you for participating. And I think, you know, some really profound questions from my point of view that have been raised, and such interesting conversations that should continue, I think. I would love to think that eventually we can all become interviewers as well as interviewees, so that students can be interviewers, but also alumni can be interviewers. We've got to guard the methodology and make sure that it's stable, so we don't have 1,000 flowers blooming in that regard. But I think there's just so much scope for people to get out there and enjoy those conversations with our alumni. So don't be shy about putting your hand up, either to be interviewed or to be an interviewer, because we could start to move into that. We need to be modest about our capacity to deliver. So, but we will be diligent and try and get there. So please contact Associate Professor Ralph Hampson, whose details appear on this screen. And really, I think the other thing we should just highlight on the screen is the people who have participated so far. And if your name isn't up there, we apologise for that. We just may not have got there at the time that these slides were prepared. And we thank our participants, our interviewees for their time and their interest in contributing to their stories to this project. And here we go, here are our students who are on placement. So we thank our students, and we hope that today was a really enjoyable event. It marks the end of our 80th celebrations, and so, you know, on to the next lot, 90th, I guess. I don't know when we will celebrate these intervals, but it's been a really interesting and enjoyable morning for me, and I think for others too. So thank you so much. So I think really we are at the end of the proceedings. Thank you.